My name is Willi Semmler. I'm a faculty member in the economics department and work also for the SCEPA, the Schwarz Center of Economic Policy Analysis. The sign is here. Everybody sees this. I want to welcome the audience and of course the speaker. I will introduce Dr. Runge-Metzger a little bit later. Also want to welcome President of our university, chair of the department, other deans from other divisions here. So, and of course, very important people who come often to this event, and the students who want to also work and do research on this topic. So this event is jointly organized with the economics department and the SCEPA. SCEPA is, so to speak, the policy arm of the economics department. Teresa is going to say a little bit more on this. And before I start, I want to thank the staff of the SCEPA, Bridget Fischer and also Raffaela Chape and some students who prepared this event, which finally works out every semester. We have this event. This is funded or is sponsored by the Thyssen Foundation and the IMK Institute for Macroeconomic Analysis in Germany. We have started such discussion on climate issues several years ago already. There was the first conference 2010 where we brought together climate scientists, geoscientists, economists, so to speak, to assess the trends in climate change. Then we had another conference after this on focusing more on renewable energy. And this was after the Sandy storm, and the crowd was, of course, much bigger than we have now here. Then we got last year another grant from the Thyssen Foundation for a 2 years speaker series, and this is supposed to provide a platform of some discussions, European, US, high-profile speakers to keep the topic going. I would say in the US it's hard to move it quickly forward in the US, but to keep the topic going. And we had last fall Mark Jacobson from Stanford talking about the renewable energy. He's very optimistic. He thinks we can do it until 2030. So all new energy is produced by renewable energy. So there's optimistic voices. And we have also big handbook coming out where a lot of those contributions are coming out in the handbook, which is edited by me and Lucas Bernhard. And this is, so to speak, the second event here. This now more from the European perspective. I will introduce the speaker a little bit later, but maybe now, Teresa, you want to come forward and say some words. Yeah.
I'm very happy to see you all here, and thank you very much for coming all the way from Brussels to tell us what the European Union is doing and to help expand our mission at SCEPA in the economics department to bring our really important perspective in our department to mainstream policy debates at the national and international level. So I welcome you all here. And our president, David Van Zandt, also will welcome you. This is a venue to approach pressing economic issues facing us. Climate change is essentially an economic issue. And I want to welcome David Van Zandt to address you and to welcome you as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Willie. I want to especially welcome Director Runge-Metzger for being with us today. It's great to have you here. I look at this session, this speaker series, is a critical part of what the new school does. I mean, climate change is a tremendous social problem. that we're facing. We don't always, I think your example of Sandy and the turnout right after Sandy versus, you know, at a later time just shows you how short-sighted the human being is in terms of understanding these problems. And it's people like our guest today who are really forcing us to deal with these problems. And the European Union generally, I think, has done a very good job of pressing the issue. But I think it's part of the New School tradition, too, to look for very creative and out-of-the-box and solutions to important social problems. It's varied over the generations at the New School and what problems we look at. We look at many different problems, but this is a classic kind of New School, problem to look at. So I'm very pleased about that, and I just want to add my thanks to some of the other sponsors here. You've mentioned the Fritz Thyssen Foundation. There's also the Alex Walker Foundation. You mentioned EMK, the Macroeconomic Policy Institute of the Hans Brockler Foundation. The Consulate of the Federal Republic of Germany has also been quite helpful, both in outreach and in support, and they've been our partner in a number of different areas around the university. I had the great privilege of being at a Manus concert up at the consulate not too long ago. So we were very grateful to them. And finally, I shouldn't leave this go without mentioning Bernard Schwartz. SCEPA, probably all of you know what it means, but it is the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis. And Bernard Schwartz has been a very generous supporter of SCEPA in general over the years. Without his support, it'd be very difficult to put on any of this. Willie has already mentioned that this is part of a general program. Both we've had those two conferences, but also now we have the speaker series. This is the second in that speaker series of looking at this issue. And I think it's bringing guests such as we have today here that helps us think about this very important problem, and which is an economic and social. They're really the same thing. Economic and social is all the same thing. And I think we clearly have a lot to learn in the United States from our guests' experience, and also from the European Union and how they are trying to approach these problems. So let me turn it back to Willie to do the formal introduction. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we get to the main point, to the main part of this evening. So I want to introduce Dr. Artur Runge-Metzger. He was trained as an agricultural economist at the University of Göttingen, early interested in agriculture, rural areas, ecological problems, and development economics. He spent some time also in Africa, his first-hand experience in African countries. He is now, this says here on the slides, Director of European Commission of International and Climate Strategy for the Climate Action Directorate General, and he has been in this position since 2009. He joined the European Commission in 1993, starting his career as part of the European Commission delegation to Africa, and working on bilateral cooperation covering agricultural policy, rural development, and environment. From the end of 1997, he was concentrating then on environment and environmental issues and climate change issues in Brussels. In 2001, he was appointed head of operations in the EC delegation, not ECB, EC delegation to Bosnia and Herzegovina. He took up his position as head of the climate, ozone and energy unit in 2003, and this crowns his long time work. Namely, he since 2003 he has been now the chief negotiator, or one of the chief negotiators for UN climate negotiation. And he was also was vice president in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Bureau. So he's a well-experienced politician, but also good academics who has experience in the field in different countries. And particular welcome him today to talk about the European perspective. 2020 is and we will want to hear what this means. 2020 in Europe, what program is there set up, and will Europe still be the leader on the climate front or not? They have not only the problem of climate change in Europe, that you probably all know, some other problems in Europe. And so to what extent the other problems may interact with the climate program and the prospect there, that will probably be discussed and will come up in the discussion. But in any case, I want to welcome Dr. Runge-Metzger to give the presentation here today. And we will have, after the presentation, then can have questions and answers on this side. So thank you for coming here again. And please start. This is all set up?
Yes. Willie, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me again to the New School. I think I can say, as a German, it's always a particular pleasure to be at the New School, because of the particular history. So today I want to talk really about, and I have to disappoint my friends who work on the international negotiations, only about Europe and what's happening in Europe. We have adopted a few years ago a climate and energy package in the year 2009, and the implementation really started on 1st of January 2013. So we are kind of 3 months into the implementation of this big package, which sets out our targets until the year 2020. And I'm not going to go into all the details of European climate policy. There is many, many, many more aspects. I will focus on 3 things, on carbon pricing, on renewables, and on adaptation, in order to make sure that you get out of the room early enough before darkness rises. But then what I will also do is I will give you a glimpse on how we are looking forward into the future beyond 2020. For the private sector, investments, infrastructure investments, you have to plan them well ahead. And private sector is telling us today, look, 2020, kind of, that's done already. All the investments, more or less, are already in the books, and they will be executed. 2030 is something we'll need to look at, and we need policy certainty. And when you listen to my talk about carbon pricing and renewables, you will understand how important certainty is going to be for private sector. And then at the end, I will conclude very quickly. So what do we have as the climate and energy package that starts as of, oops, wrong way around, of 1st January 2013. It's really an integrated approach that not only deals with climate change, and that is something that is very often forgotten when people look at this climate and energy package, because it was also supposed to deal with energy security, so therefore it has a very strong renewables aspect in it, and it's talking about European Union competitiveness. So also industrial policy is something, an aspect in this package that is very important to make sure that we are not kind of pricing ourselves out of the global markets, but try to stay in. In terms of the targets that have been set, there's 3 very distinct targets beyond all the other legislation that is there. One is reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% compared to 1990. And we have 2 ways of doing that. One, and I will talk about that more in detail, is the EU emissions trading system that covers around 40 to 45% of total EU emissions. And then we have what we call the non-ETS sectors, where we have national emissions targets. So the 28 member states for agriculture, for buildings, have transport, have their own national emission targets. But I'm not going to talk about that here today. If you have a question later on, I'm certainly willing and prepared to answer those. The second big target is, headline target, is to increase the share of renewables in the EU's energy mix to 20%. And the final one is to improve energy efficiency by 20% compared to business as usual projections. So therefore, some people also call it the 20-20-20 package, because it has 3 times 20% in it. I will start from maybe the wrong end, looking at where are we in Europe with our emissions. Very often I hear somehow over the last weeks and months that it seems that European climate policy is not successful, it has not succeeded. If you look at EU emissions and you see here the dark blue line, how they developed since the year 1990, you see that since the beginning of 2000 they're constantly going down. And I think this is when European climate policy started, very cautiously. The EU ETS only came into play in the year 2005. But what you will also see is the backdrop in the years 2009, 2010. And that, of course, is partly to be explained by the economic and financial crisis. So if you now compare this trend of emissions against the kind of commitments we have been taking internationally, and that is the little red line here, that is what we said under the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, -8% for the EU 15 and the various other targets for the other member states. That would have been the allowed amount for the European Union. So compare that against the actual emissions, we can say we have overachieved, and we will overachieve in terms of the first commitment period. That is good, but that also has kind of some disadvantages, and I'll talk about that a little later. If we look into the future from 2012 onwards until the year 2020, we have set our own package, the 2020 package, and that is the dark line, the big dark line that you can see here. That is kind of the emission budget that is available for the EU 27 member states under the emissions trading system and outside the emissions trading system. And the green line that you will see is what we have committed to internationally, the second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol, if anybody has ever heard about this in this room, is something we agreed to only a few months ago in December in Doha, where there was the last UN climate summit. And that is the budget that is set in terms of the international commitment. What is also still on the table in Europe is an offer to the rest of the world that we could increase our emissions reduction target to 30%. And here you can see the dotted line that is trying to indicate where we are at the moment. So if you would say today, okay, today we are somewhere here, and for 2012 it's likely that emissions will go further down, we are not faring badly. And our expectation, making our internal projections until the year 2020, say on average we will be fine, we will achieve our 2020 targets. And we might even overachieve. Not maybe by such a huge margin as for the first commitment period, but there is a possibility. So now I will go into the EU emissions trading system. What have we created? As I said already, we cover around 40% of total greenhouse gas emissions. It's all the energy sector that is covered and all industrial sectors like ceramics, steel, cement production, all of these big sectors where you have big power plants, they are covered by the emissions trading system. Across Europe, the 27 member states, you have a single carbon price, which means also you have a level playing field between the different sectors, between different member states, because there is one way of allocating now the allowances to those sectors. For the energy sector, it's done. They will have to buy all their emission allowances for the period 2013 to 2020. The industrial sectors, they get free allocation of their allowances on the basis of efficiency benchmarks for the different sectors. And they have been established equally across the board throughout Europe. We have a functioning and very liquid market. If you look into the newspapers, you will see that last year we had the highest turnover of CO2 allowances in Europe, so the market is working. What we can also see is the market is reflecting demand and supply. And the next slide I will show a little bit more. And it gives long-term clarity because there is a gradient, 1.74% per year. Emissions have to go down. That's how the cap goes down. And not only until the year 2020, the default is that it will continue until the year 2050 or 2100 with that gradient. So there is no clause in the legislation that says in 2020 it ends. It continues into the long-term future. But what has happened over the last years during the recession, and you can see that here, it's the dark bars at the bottom. This is what were the allowances that were handed out. And then you see the dark line that marches through it. That is the actual emissions. And what you can see is that actual emissions were lower than the cap. And of course, the companies who have these allowances, they can put them into their savings account. And what we have been building up over the last years is this savings account. You see the red line, that's the build-up here in terms of the surplus allowances that come in over time. And that is not only the allowances that companies have been saving. No, of course, it's emissions trading. It means you can also use offset credits. And offset credits from the so-called clean development mechanism in the international market, they are cheaper than the allowances. So everybody with an economic mind will say, okay, let's swap. Let's buy CDM and use those in order to fulfill your obligations and keep the allowances in your pocket. So what we have been seeing up till the year 2012 is that around 2 billion tons of allowances are being saved in the whole system. And that means that is an oversupply in the system. And what has happened is that the price for allowances has been crashing. And I think that's kind of first page of every macroeconomics textbook. If supply is larger than demand, then prices go down. That's exactly what has happened in the emissions trading market. But this is a huge amount of allowances. 2 billion is more than a year of emissions in Europe. The last year's statistics just came out yesterday. So all the companies under the ETS, they emitted something like 1.88 gigatons. And you have 2 gigatons that are already sitting there in terms of allowances that have not been used. So what we see in the market is this. The price has been going down. And at the moment, we are somewhere at 4 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. And that, of course, is problematic. Because the whole reason why you have emissions trading was you want to incentivize innovation. You want to incentivize low-carbon technologies, and for that, a certain price needs to be paid. So what are the effects now of a low-carbon price? People compare it and say, okay, if you have to pay for your carbon emissions in a coal-fired power plant, then you have to add a certain amount for these allowances. So, and they compare that to, okay, what's the next alternative? And very often it's compared to gas. Firing your power plants with gas. And if you make this price comparison, the dark spread, how some people call it in the market, you will see that at the moment it's not economical to fire gas. It's more economical to import cheap coal from the United States and fire cheap coal in Europe. So if you look at the emission statistics in detail, you will see that some of the major electricity suppliers in Europe, they have been switching towards more coal. In total, the picture for the European Union is still good in terms of total emissions because we had some very wet years in Northern Europe. So a lot of hydropower has been used in the whole Denmark, Sweden, Finland area. who would normally fire a lot of coal, and therefore kind of emissions are down, and also because of industrial sectors who have not produced at the limit. So people are now asking, okay, we need to do something in order to stop the price from going down, because there's no incentive for companies to invest in these low carbon technologies. And there comes a big problem, because if we want to kind of make changes to the legislation, it means we have to go through the entire process with making a proposal from the side of the Commission, get it to the 27 member states and the Council, and also discuss it with the European Parliament. And in the end, this co-decision process has to make the necessary changes. I could say one thing we overlooked when we were drafting the legislation on the ETS is we have never looked at a situation where you are in an economic recession, where you have this build-up of allowances and your price is going down. At the time when we were drafting the legislation, the one thing people's mind was occupied, in particular industry, is what happens if the price goes up too high, and we would price ourselves out of the market. So you will have several articles in the legislation giving the Commission power to act in a situation where prices suddenly go up to something like 30 euros per ton of carbon dioxide, and in order to address that situation. But we have never gotten any kind of powers to do something in a situation where you have a recession and the price is going to crash and you have an oversupply of allowances. In individual member states, they want to take action. Like the UK, for instance, is discussing a carbon price floor. But if you're an economist, you will know if you are in a single market, if one part of the market puts up a carbon price, a floor price, then it only means that others can even emit more, because kind of in the end, what counts is the cap, is the overall level of scarcity, and it's not what you do in a particular country. The same in the Netherlands. They are discussing at the moment a coal tax, a specific coal tax. So the risk there is that the European market, the single market, is going to be fragmented. So there is need for some action from the EU side. And how we want to try to address this is in a two-step approach. First of all, we want to make sure that there is not more overhang getting into the market. So that means we look at the auctioning of the allowances this year, and we have proposed to postpone the auctioning of 900 million allowances to a later stage, the so-called backloading. And this is something we can do in the current context of the legislation. We don't have to change the legislation. We can deal with that through comitology. In a second step, we can look at structural action. That means to add the one or two articles you need in a piece of legislation to address a situation where you have an enormous surplus accruing because of an economic recession. And there is 6 options that we have been proposing. One of those is to increase the target until 2020. But of course, that would not get rid really of the structural issue, because what happens if a similar thing would happen in the year 2035 or 37? We could say retire all those 900 million allowances we have been putting into the fridge. Again, it's a one-off method, but it doesn't really look at the structural issues. To revise the linear factor, so instead of 1.74%, increase that factor in order to create more demand, so that we eat up the supply. Include other sectors into the ETS. One possibility that is being thought of is, for instance, transport emissions. 20% of EU emissions, around 20% is transport. So if you would put them into the ETS, you would create more demand. So you could get rid of this supply overhang. We could limit access to international credits, so you don't have any longer the swapping, buying cheap credits from developing countries, and keep your own credits from Europe. or we could go into discretionary price management, like the proposal in the UK, talking about a price floor and get in as government. Something I believe, at least in our house, in the climate action part of the Commission, is not something we are really supporting, particularly knowing how unsuccessful we are on the common agriculture policy, something I have never said here. So these are the things in terms of how we want to address the shortcomings in the EU ETS. So before I move over to the renewables part, maybe I should conclude a little thing in saying that the EU ETS functions, and it functions like it should in the textbook. But there are certain things in terms of the design we got wrong. So if ever the United States is going to do an emissions trading system, there is an open invitation not to make the same mistakes. You also need to consider a situation when you get into a recession and how you deal with that with a market which would then go into oversupply. Now we come to the second point, renewables policy. What have we achieved in Europe with our renewables policy? Something that did not start only on the 1st January 2013, but it started much earlier. We had the first policies in Germany, very successful, in Denmark, and also in Spain, where you see an acceleration of deployment of renewable energy, particularly wind energy, in the first phase. Also considerable emission reductions were achieved, and there is, of course, also an interplay of the renewables policy with the ETS policy, particularly in a time where you have an economic depression. So, because this is a hard target as well, and member states must achieve the 20% reduction here. So there is a very strong interplay with the emissions trading system. Because if that is the policy that is the most stringent one, then it will take out the stringency from the ETS policy. What it also did is that it was driving economies of scale and driving down the costs of key technologies. Wind in the first place, and in the second place it was, over the last years, photovoltaics, where there were considerable policies in some of the major member states, and you could see a large rise in the deployment of solar technologies. A whole industry was created in Germany. But then later on, our Chinese competitors were very strong in picking up on that market and building their solar industry on the back of European Union renewables policies. Where have we come to at this point in time? We are so successful, particularly on the photovoltaics, which is a very expensive policy. It's a very expensive technology. If you look at it in terms of price per ton of CO2 reduced, you think of somewhere 100 to 200 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. So it's not the most cost efficient. But that's not the point at this point in time, because the main thing at the moment is to drive the technology into the market and to reduce the price. And that was done successfully. It's not yet competitive with other fossil fuel technologies, but at least we are getting into the right direction. But because of, again, of the design of the policy, we have now some shortcomings because it was built on public subsidies. Now with the financial crisis in Europe, you get into a problem that public coffers are empty and it's very hard to maintain the same level of support. And particularly in Spain, for instance, where the renewables policy is designed on direct subsidies from the state coffers, they had to stop their whole support schemes to the renewable sector. And that, of course, has brought the whole renewable sector into turmoil. So we have achieved a lot up to now, but how it's going to go further until the year 2020, that is very uncertain. And even in Germany, which is always a very sophisticated country when it comes to policy making, and where it's not the government that is paying the price for the renewables, but it's the consumer, we have a major problem in the policy statement, because the renewables were going so fast into the energy mix that energy prices have been falling as a consequence, which means that the level of subsidy was increased. So the feed-in tariff that had to be distributed to all the consumers was rising very strongly. Particularly this year, it was almost doubling. And then you start having problems with your consumers. And particularly in Germany, where they exempted some of the electricity-intensive industry from paying the feed-in tariff. And they broadened that exemption considerably over the last 3 years. So again, policy design was not up to speed, so the policy is starting to kill itself. So at the moment, there is a big question on what types of alterations do we need to make to national support schemes? How can we make sure that this is still part of a successful industrial policy? There's a question also, because the systems are so different in Germany. Some do feed-in tariffs, some to direct subsidies, some to renewable portfolio standards and certificate trading, green certificate trading. Should we not try to bring these things together to have a market, a single market on renewables in Europe? We have a major problem when it comes to market integration, and that has to do with the grids. Traditionally, our electricity system in Europe was cut into 4 big blocks with very poor interlinkages to each other, and that now is also hampering the extension of the renewables, where, for instance, when you look at wind, you have a lot of wind around the North Sea, but you have a major part of the consumption in southern Germany, so you need to make sure that you have sufficient power lines getting there. And that is not there at the present point in time. And that is one of the big, it's an Achilles heel for the European renewables policy. And it's an area which we would want to address in the coming years with major investments into the European grid. And then finally, there is also questions like the sustainability of some of the renewables policies, and particularly when it comes to biofuels and biomass. And I know that in the United States, you have exactly the same kind of discussions. Is biomass crowding out food products, for instance, and is it driving food prices in other parts of the world, particularly in a situation where the population is going to increase in the coming decades worldwide, and where we will need to have more food produced in order to feed all the people who will be living in this world. And that is a question where we haven't found yet the answer. We are kind of tinkering around with this, with sustainability indexes, and but I think we are not yet very successful in dealing with this issue. If you look at the where we stand on implementing the 20% target, we can say at this present point in time, on average, we are on line to reach the 2020 target. But there is, if you look member state by member state, you see very different performances. Here, the light blue lines are the renewables, the actual renewables in the year 2010, and compared with the dark blue bars, which is the 2020 target. You see here on the left-hand side, for instance, Sweden. Sweden is almost there. There's only a few percentage points missing to reach their 2020 renewables target. If you look at the right-hand side, you see, for instance, the United Kingdom. They are very far away from reaching their individual target. So again, performance from member state to member state is very different. On average, we are still there. But the major issue is which direction is renewables policies going to go in the coming years, particularly when we have the strain in public finance in Europe. And we'll still have to deal with that for a couple of years, I fear. Let me now come to the third little chapter, and that is adaptation to climate change. Adaptation policies in Europe was something that was a little bit the orphan of the climate change policy for a long time. I remember discussions about 10 years ago where kind of when you would start talking about adaptation, people would think that you're heretic because you are against the mitigation policies and you think now it's all adaptation. But on the other hand, if we believe in what climate models tell us and what the climate data sets tell us, that climate change is happening, we know that we need to do something. And we have seen major floodings in Europe, and the climate models say there will be more of that type of thing happening in the future, so we need to do something. But where are we heading to? And I think that is probably the primary concern at the present point in time. Because in the end, global climate change doesn't depend on whether we are successful in our mitigation policies in the European Union. We only have, I think, 11 or 12% of global emissions. Even if we shut down our economy tomorrow, the climate change is not going to decrease in terms of the pace and the speed of that climate change. So it depends very much on what our partners are doing around the world. And that's not only the United States, but also China, India, and all the other major economies, and in effect, all the economies that emit. And there, of course, the outlook is not that good. We have been saying in Copenhagen, yes, 2 degrees, that should be the kind of limit in terms of change. And even that, compared to today, where we experience 0.8 degrees C, is still a dramatic increase. So if we were to go in the green area, that is the kind of emission profile we would have to see in this world in the coming years. But if you add up everything that has been promised since Copenhagen by the around 90 countries and that includes the United States with its minus 17% compared to 2005 target in 2020, we will only get onto the purple line in terms of emissions. So there is a kind of a huge gap in ambition when it comes to mitigation. If you translate that into temperature, you would say, okay, by the end of the century, you will end up around 3.5, 4 degrees, or 4.5 degrees. That's the kind of range climate models are predicting if we continue along that course of emissions in the coming decades. And that is a point of concern, of course, because that is a huge risk. And how does that translate in reality to individual citizens? In Europe, there was one particular event, that was the summer 2003, which was extremely hot. We had a heat wave in August that we had never seen really before in the climate records. The black ones here is the actual temperature record in Europe, and that is the year 2003. And it's really sticking out there. And the effects were enormous in that year. We had tens of thousands of premature deaths of old people who were not able to cope with that. So if you now let climate change go, and this is what the red line tells you, in the years 2040s, so that is 30 years from now on, the 2003 summer is an average summer. And if you look into the end of the century, then you would say, oh, the 2003 summer is really a cool summer. And okay, I will not be around for sure, but let's say my granddaughter was born 6 months ago. I think there's a likelihood that she will become 90. So she will experience that kind of climate. So I think we need to be sure that we will be prepared for this type of weather at the end of the century if we can't get our mitigation policies right. The same is true for precipitation. You see here the annual and the summer rainfall in Europe as predicted towards the end of the century. And you will see that we will have a major problem in Europe in all the countries around the Mediterranean. So that's not only the European countries, but it's also our North African neighbors. And that, of course, will have major implications, not only for agriculture production. No, it will also have major implications in terms of what do people live on in North Africa in that time. And where do they get their water from? And what are they going to do as a consequence? So there is a big fear of some geopolitical consequences that you might face if you let climate change go unabatedly. So in Europe, we have done a full map in looking at different parts of Europe, what kind of challenges they are going to face. In all the port areas, you will have to deal with sea level rise. We know that this is something that is very hard to change in terms of the speed at which it's going and in terms of the levels. It's very predictable until the end of the century, and it means something for your port infrastructures, whether it's in Hamburg, Rotterdam, Antwerp. You will have to take this into account. You will have to take it into account in your dike infrastructure in northern Germany. We were talking about the drying up of the Mediterranean. So there, agriculture, energy is highly dependent on water for cooling. If you don't have sufficient water for cooling, then let's say you can close down your energy plant. And in the summer 2003, there were incidences in parts of Europe where it was not possible to continue operating a power plant. In further north in Europe, you will have issues with the distribution of rainfall. Too much water, too much at certain points in time. So we have identified those kind of risks that are coming up and that will have to be managed in the coming years. What we are aiming at in the end is a climate policy that has the two parts, the mitigation part and the adaptation part, and hopefully in a cost-efficient manner. It's easier said than done, because this is not kind of a little deterministic calculation, but you talk about a probabilistic and risk management issues that you need to have. We know that adaptation is inevitable and that it makes things, of course, cheaper. A euro invested in flood protection is going to save something like 6 euros in terms of damage cost. What we also know is that if we postpone adaptation, it might lead to higher costs at a later point in time. So also here, timeliness of adaptation is something that is important. Still, if you look at the economics of adaptation, it's still a field where I think many people can earn their PhDs there. It's something that is not really being looked at in a very systematic manner. We don't have really an overview like we have with mitigation, where kind of we are doing this modeling for the past almost 30 years. And we are refining our modeling and even now looking at employment aspects, trying to get them into the models. On the adaptation, we are not that far in terms of policy planning. So a lot needs to be done on that side, and science hopefully can help us here. And one question you might want to pose to me is, why are you thinking about adaptation in Brussels? Because adaptation, in the end, is something that is for local communities. That's for the owners of the properties. They will have to take action. We think from the EU side, there's a few tasks where we can help member states, where we can help regions in Europe, where we can help cities in Europe to achieve their results in a more efficient manner. One is that, of course, there is a cross-border dimension on adaptation, particularly if you look at watershed management. You have the big rivers like the Rhine, the Elbe, that flow across different countries, and it's good to bring these countries together and start to have a trans-border approach. In some areas, we have particular competence, like on agriculture. When it comes to capacity building and research, data gathering, it's good to bring the scientists together in order to work together. Particularly if you look at these big areas, kind of when you look at port infrastructure, why only let the University of Hamburg do it or the University of Rotterdam? Let them work together to find solutions together that could be cheaper. The same is true for data gathering and the whole issue of knowledge transfer. And then there is a question of solidarity. Member states in Europe are at a very different stage of development. We have very poor member states like Bulgaria, and we have very rich member states like Luxembourg. So there is an element of solidarity where people should help each other, and that is part of our essential fabric of the European Union to talk about solidarity. And finally, of course, we have a budget. 1% of GDP of the European Union is European Union public budget that we can spend in order to help in getting forward with adaptation. So what we are going to propose, and this strategy is going to come out in a few weeks' time, is to promote action by member states to make sure that they will have national adaptation strategies, then to help cities, regions to really go into actions, to fund pilot programs, pilot projects on adaptation. We will spend a lot of money on research and technology development when it comes to adaptation. We already have a publicly accessible web platform where we try to bring all the knowledge together, the Climate Adapt, which is hosted by the European Environment Agency. And then we look at particular sectors, and that's particular sectors like transport, like energy, where you make long-term investments. So you spend $1 today and you expect it to be there for the next 50 years. How can we make sure that this is spent in a manner that the investment is climate resilient? And finally, we are looking at the insurance sector. There seem to be some shortcomings in the way insurance premiums are being calculated. They are mainly calculated on historic events, but not looking forward. So how can we make sure that we can engage the insurance sector? Because the insurance sector, through pricing, can drive behavior and investment in the private sector. And that is something we are exploring in the coming years. So that is my chapter until 2020. So now I'll give you the glimpse on beyond 2020. First and foremost, there's, of course, the mitigation challenge. Where do we need to go in terms of our emissions? And if we want to stay below 2 degrees, kind of what the reports tell us here from the United Nations Environment Programme, you will have to cut your emissions in 2030 by around 20% compared to today's emissions, or bring it back to the level of around 1990. And that is a big ask. Kind of our emissions since 1990 for the last 30 years have been going up and up and up and up. And now we're saying within 10 years, you go back to 1990. So that is quite a big challenge that is ahead of us, and not only of the EU. Another big challenge we have and face in the European Union is our dependency on imported fossil fuels. If we would continue with our policies and in the way we have done in the past, our dependency on imports would rise from 60 to 80%. This is what the International Energy Agency says. So we have to do something about our energy security in the coming decade. We also have an energy price challenge, and one of these challenges is caused by recent developments in the United States. Because of the huge amounts of shale gas that have become available at very, very low prices, kind of our industry is eyeing the favorable energy prices in the United States and saying, oh, it looks much better over there. Why are we not going to relocate our steel factories from Europe to the United States, in the hope, of course, that you would have these cheap energy prices still in 2 or 3 decades' time. That, of course, is a big question. I think one of the reasons why gas prices are so low at the moment is that they are not linked to the international market. There's no outlet for the gas to the international market. And I think that those gas producers, they would love to have their fingers in the international market because prices are 5 times as high as at home. So they could make a much bigger buck. But at the moment, the LNG terminals in the United States do not have the capability to export. And we know that there's a lot of applications lying in the White House waiting to be approved, and we shall see. It might be something we will be taking up with the White House in our free trade talks we are going to have with the United States. So that is another challenge, energy prices, also for your industrial policy. We have already said in Europe that we want to stay in that green line in the long term. So we need to reduce our emissions by 80 to 95% compared to 1990 in the year 2050. There is a need for a low carbon roadmap until the year 2030, and that we need to fix the intermediate stages until 2050. We have done a study about 1.5 years ago, where you will see, in terms of our current policy, the 2020 policy, our emissions would go down the red line, and that is in 2050, if you look at the right end of the graph, far away from where we need to be, minus 80%. But we have looked at current technologies, we have looked at all the economic sectors, the technologies that are available, and it would be possible to get down to minus 80% in the year 2050 in a cost-efficient manner. But of course, what it means is it's a major investment program into your own European Union economy if you want to achieve that. It means, for instance, that you need to decarbonize your power sector completely by the year 2050. That you will only achieve if you have technologies like carbon capture and storage available, if you further ramp up your renewable energy sector, that you will have to introduce, as of 2030, CCS even in your industrial sector, because there's process emissions that you will always have when you produce cement or other things that you need to take care of. You will talk about electrification of transport as of 2030, and transport is one of the more difficult sectors to deal with when it comes to emissions. And then in the end, you have agriculture, where that is a very difficult sector to tackle. If you look here, in 1990, agriculture emissions were about kind of 10%, the non-CO2 agriculture emissions. In the year 2050, there will be about 1/3 of the total emissions mix. So that is a very difficult area to tackle. But it is technically feasible, and it is economically affordable. If you look at in terms of investment, it means you will have to invest over the next decades around 1.5% of your European Union GDP in order to make that change. That compares to in total investment we do every year of around 20%. So it's a significant increase that you require. But it's not more than kind of the fall we have seen during the economic recession of our investment activity over the last years, which was also 1.5%. At the same time, you will have the benefit of fuel savings. You reduce your energy bill quite dramatically, and it depends a little bit on the prices, how they would develop internationally. That could cater for half up to the total of your investment, but that depends on how energy prices are going to develop in the coming years. So at the moment, we are going now one step further after saying, okay, it's technically feasible, it's economically affordable, kind of how are you going to do it? Because it requires public policy. And what type of policies do you want to use? Do you want to continue with the same package as we had it until the year 2020, with 3 targets that are overlapping with each other and interfere also with each other? Or is it sufficient to just talk about emissions trading and have only a greenhouse gas emissions target? What type of coherent set of policy instruments do you need? How do you make sure that you foster competitiveness of your industry and not drive industry out of Europe? And then the last big question is, how do you acknowledge the different capabilities of the different member states? I mentioned Bulgaria. Compared to Luxembourg, their capabilities are very different. How do you acknowledge that in the policy mix when you design your policies? And we have started this process right now, last week, a green paper came out which poses exactly those types of questions to European stakeholders, industry, non-governmental organizations, in order to move forward the internal policy debate in Europe before the backdrop of all the experiences we have gathered so far with the implementation of our 2020 package. By mid this year, we should get a feedback from those stakeholders. At the same time, we'll do our enhanced impact assessments, which is macroeconomic modeling, looking at different policy instruments, how you employ them, what does it mean for the costs for individual member states, what does it mean to your employment, and how to move this policy forward. And our political masters tell us that we need to be ready with our analysis before the end of this year. And then we'll see whether this will end up in a legislative proposal or whether it's going to be a kind of a policy proposal for further discussion by the Council. So with that, my conclusions, the new area has started. I think we are broadly on track to meet our targets, but we are facing in our set of policy instruments some serious challenges. I mentioned the emissions trading system with the low prices. I mentioned the renewables policies where member states are changing them, making things volatile, uncertain, so that investments are no longer moving at the same pace. And then beyond 2020, we are looking at this new policy framework, developing that further together with stakeholders in the coming 2 to 3 years. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for the clear and comprehensive overview of where Europe is going, and it's somewhat very optimistic in its outlook, I think. In particular, I like the 3 areas that were discussed, emission trading, renewables, and adaptation. And the last point is an important point being discussed in New York since Sandy, and I think you will get now some good, interesting questions from the American audience, from American side. We have 2 microphones left and right, and so people should line up somewhat on the microphones and ask the questions from there. You would have one or mehr als eine, oder?
Ja?
Ja, mehr als eine?
Kann ruhig mehr als eine.
Ja.
To begin with, you seem very concerned about the economics of it, and you went to trading policies. How would it have been if you went to taxing? Wouldn't you have been more efficient? And wouldn't you have gotten what you wanted, more of the carbon out? Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing, when you talked about the solar energy, you used the word feed-in. I didn't quite know what you meant, but does that mean that the solar was so cheap that it was you weren't making a profit on using it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll take the 2 questions. The carbon tax, that has been a long discussion in Europe. The thing is, in terms of our constitution of the European Union, everything that is related to taxation requires consensus in terms of decision making. So we started off in terms of climate policies in the early 90s, making exactly that proposal. Go for a carbon tax that is European, EU-wide. But we could never get consensus among the member states. In the beginning, it were only 15, later on 28. So coming with a tax proposal at the level of the European Union in Brussels is a dead horse. So after kind of Europe was for a long time dead against emissions trading, and we hated how the United States was introducing that into the Kyoto Protocol, we turned around because we can do emissions trading with qualified majority voting. And if you look at the economics literature, carbon pricing, whether you do it through a tax or through emissions trading, it is an efficient market-based instrument. And when discussing with our industry in the end, we got the impression that many of our industry, they prefer emissions trading because they have more options in terms of how they can act. For a carbon tax, you have two possibilities. You emit and you pay the tax, or you try to bring in a new technology so you emit less and you don't have to pay the tax. With emissions trading, you have a third option, because there's a possibility to find another place where emissions can be reduced at a lower price, and you can buy those certificates. And that trading aspect is something that is appreciated by European industry, particularly the power sector.
You mean you're going to go on with that policy?
We
You haven't
will-
changed your mind?
We will continue with that policy. We know that we'll have to fix the instrument, that we haven't gotten it 100% right yet. And I mentioned the reason is the economic recession, where kind of, you throw your scarcity out of the window, and that means your price goes down and you get the wrong price signal. But I'm sure that in the coming years we are going to fix that issue as well and have a solution for this, because it's not very difficult to fix. What you need to make sure is that you have you keep your quantitative limit, and you don't allow, even through banking, an increase in that kind of cap. And that is a design issue that can be fixed if member states want to fix it. On your second question, the feed-in tariff and the photovoltaics and the story of the renewables. The feed-in tariff means that customers are paying a higher electricity price, and that this element of a subsidy is being paid to the ones who produce renewable energy. So it's the ones who produce solar energy, they get a higher price, a guaranteed feed-in price into the electricity grid.
Are you saying really that solar energy becomes more expensive than energy that comes from fossil fuels?
At the moment, because of the price of the technology, solar energy is still one of the more expensive renewable energies, yes. Even despite the fact that we have been seeing prices for solar panels dropping by 50% within a period of 4 or 5 years. So that was a dramatic reduction. But still, if you look at the competitiveness, it's still not yet on par with the other energy forms, and it will require some kind of support from the side of public policy. It's not going. It runs on its own when you do it in isolated areas off-grid, like many places in Africa. It's probably the most competitive solution. But when you are on the grid and you compete directly with...
putting the solar energy into the grid might be expensive, but putting solar energy onto a house, it seems to me, is the most best way of saving money. The owner of the house does not have to pay for energy. He doesn't have to buy coal or gas.
Yes, but if you calculate that in kind of the price per kilowatt hour, it's still an expensive... and you might want to do it for completely different reasons, of course. If you want to be independent of your energy supplier, you might want to pay this premium. And many do that, in fact, in Europe.
To the left side, your two microphones, yeah.
Yeah, permit me to ask 2 quick questions too. One, by what heuristic or algorithm was the first allocation of certificates arrived at, which obviously wasn't very effective now that the price goes down? And in what way will the new decision, your structural decision to allocate another number, how will it be based on a different procedure, or what are these? I would like you to elaborate on that. And second, assuming that economic growth needs material resources, including energy, is there any controversy in the Commission, in the European Union, about this climate strategy blocking perhaps a recovery of the European Union and economy? And maybe I know now you have overachieved the targets, so it's probably not a big deal, but in the longer run, that there might be any trade-off between economic growth and your beyond 2020 targets.
On the first question, in terms of how was the cap fixed for the European Union emissions trading system? Of course, it was fixed on the basis of projections of your economic development. But when these projections were made in 2007, nobody was saying, oh, hang on, by the way, in 2 years' time, you will be in the deepest economic recession ever, because nobody knew. And even the best macroeconomists in Europe, when we started getting into the crisis, were still prognosing kind of, oh, development will be going fine. So nobody projected the economic recession. And you can see, if you look here in the beginning, in 2008, the emissions here on the left-hand side, they are higher than the cap. And that was kind of what we had in our, as outcomes from our macroeconomic modeling, that at any point in time, as of 2008 until 2020, the cap would be below the projected emissions under a business as usual case. But of course, what was not calculated is that we had then a major drop in the emissions because of the economic recession. So what was missing is to say, instead of having this build-up of the allowances, you probably would have to say, okay, you keep the cap, and what you save and you turn into the next period, instead of adding it on top of the cap, you say it's going to be part of the cap. So you keep your allowances, you can use them for the next period, but governments are certainly going to auction much less allowances than what they had planned before. So that is one mechanism in which you can make sure that you are not going to create this huge overhang in terms of allowances. That is going to be a problem for the coming decade. And kind of if our emissions are not really picking up in the coming years, we will have that overhang even after the year 2020. So it's a design fault in the legislation. The second question was on whether we have a debate. Of course we have a debate. We have exactly the same debate as you have in the United States on is climate policy, particularly mitigation policies, putting an end to our economic development. Because we have to deal with, or we have to use completely different forms of energy, and they are much more expensive. So it's like throwing us back into the Stone Age. We have that debate as well in Europe. I think what we can show is that over the last decade, our economy has become more and more efficient. The carbon intensity of our economy has gone down and down and down. And if you do an analysis on the basis of, okay, what are your technological options? What is the price of those technologies? And if you introduce them into the economy, this is what all these macroeconomic models do, it is possible to even see economic growth. Because what you shave off your economic growth is a few percentage points in the end. For the 2030 projection, for instance, where we would say, okay, we want to go down to minus 40%. In 2030, our GDP is predicted to be doubled compared to the year 1990. So we are not saying you do climate policies and kick out any kind of economic growth policy. No. The thing you say is instead of becoming 2 times richer, you will become 1.96 times richer. But you will have a climate-safe future. That is what the options are. And there, at the moment, political majorities in Europe are saying, okay, let's forego that little difference in economic growth and go for the safe future. And we have exactly the same debate, and Dean, you will comment on that, internationally with developing countries. A lot of developing countries believe you do either poverty eradication or you fight climate change. But I think the World Bank, in its latest report, very clearly say that with climate change, economic development is out of the window. Their 4 degrees report that came out about 3 months ago says that very clearly.
Can we get 2 questions, maybe one from
Yep.
this side or one from the other side? Yeah, so here first, and then we,
You spoke about
maybe there's one. Yeah.
sorry. You spoke about climate policies at the level of the entire bloc. Do you have any examples of aggressive climate policy at the level of individual countries or cities that go even beyond the EU-wide policy?
Mm-hmm. Yes. As I, yeah.
Sorry, I have 2 questions, though.
I'll try to remember them.
Okay. My first question is regarding you talking about the adaptation needs of different countries in Europe and also the impact to the neighbor of the North African country that are threatened by food security, etc., which resulting in also questions of environmental refugee, which is a broader topic for adaptation, whether that's part of the discussion of EU climate policy on the table at the moment. And the second question, I know you don't want to mention too much on the international scheme, but I'm still curious in terms of looking at the China ETS pilots at the moment and the huge interest coming from EU to support either from the design scheme or technology transfer. In that sense, what is the ambition kind of from the, or aspiration from the EU policy side on the China emission trading market? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yes, you will find differences between member states in terms of their level of ambition on their national policies. I think I can say that Sweden, for instance, is a country that has very aggressive climate change policies. You spoke about the carbon tax. They have introduced a carbon tax already in the late 80s, early 90s, and that carbon tax is very efficient in terms of driving renewable energy into the heating sector, for which there is national responsibility. And in that way, you will find in different member states different policies that are more aggressive. So if you look at the renewables graph I showed you, you see the performance in different member states. And clearly, the closer you are to your target, the more aggressive your policy was. The further you are away from the target, the less aggressive your policy was. So in the United Kingdom, kind of renewables policies is something, there has been long discussions, but very little or relatively limited action internally.
Is there ever action taken at the city level in terms of aggressive energy efficiency retrofits?
Yes.
Or is that the next?
No, definitely. When it comes to energy efficiency, it's of course even more complicated. Because that is in the remit of even in some cities, in communities, when it comes to refurbishment of buildings, particular investment programs, also when it comes to local transport, introducing, for instance, gas instead of liquid fuels for public transport. You see wide differences in Europe. There are some cities who have made much more progress compared to others. And I think that's the interesting kind of laborious situation we are in Europe, and probably you also in the United States, because you will see similar things happening in the US, where some of the major cities are quite aggressive in trying to bring things forward, and others are less aggressive. So there is a possibility of learning from each other. And that is something that is important for us to enable this and facilitate that from Brussels. Bring people together from different cities who face similar challenges and questions, and make sure that they learn from each other and that the good stuff moves out forward much more quickly. On the question of adaptation, all the questions related to security, they are coming step by step onto the table. It's a few member states who have been trying to drive this discussion a little bit more strongly, like Germany and the UK. And they also brought this discussion to New York, to the United Nations. There have been discussions there on security questions. But it's still kind of lingering somewhere in the background. It has not yet come to the forefront. But certainly it will be one of the things you will hear much more about in the coming 2-3 years in this next round of negotiations for the 2015 agreement. Your second question was on international negotiations. But what was it exactly?
It was more particularly relating to the China ETS.
Yes, China ETS. No, of course, we are very interested in supporting our Chinese friends, particularly not to make the same mistakes as we made in Europe. And we have gone through a very steep learning curve in Europe. If you remember back, those of you who are a bit more familiar with the ETS, we started off with national allocation plans, which, to be honest, was a stupidity, but it was the only thing we could get through qualified majority voting in Europe. So we had to go through that kind of learning exercise in the beginning. We have gone over that and have changed the system to kick out the national allocations. So all of these things our Chinese colleagues are very interested in. They're also very interested in all the nuts and bolts of an emissions trading system, because you need to have a registry, you need to talk about how do you make sure that there is security in the system, that people do not start stealing these allowances and so on. So all of that very practical stuff they are very interested in, and we are helping them. But I believe that in the end, China will move forward on the basis of its own experience. It's not going to say, oh, Europe made this experience, and that's the reason I have to move forward. No, for them it's very clear that the first years is a kind of a training, a pilot phase. They work with 7 major cities and regions. Those 7 emission trading systems will look a little different from each other. So that allows, this diversity in itself allows for learning on the Chinese side. But there is a prospect that as of 2015, 2016, they are thinking of, okay, how can they bring this together into a single federal scheme? So I'm quite hopeful. The problem many of the Chinese colleagues have is that it's easy for them in Beijing to set a target, to say, okay, you must improve by that much percentage. But when it comes on how do you make all these economic actors in the Chinese economy working towards that kind of objective, that is where they have the big gap. So the policy instrument that you need to deploy then, because it's no longer like we sometimes seem to believe that Beijing sends a letter to province governor X and Y and Z, and then things happen tomorrow. No, it's not like that. It's much more complicated, and therefore they are interested in real policy-making instruments. And that can be the European Union emissions trading system, that can be United States air quality policies that were very successful and are still very successful. So in that way we can learn from each other on the regulatory side. Yeah?
Just a quick question. You mentioned the EU, the Commission looking in the short term to kind of move some allowances to the, that they call backloading. Do you know where that is right now, and status, likelihood of happening within a year, that kind of thing?
No, where's that right now? That was a very, very difficult discussion. We came out with a backloading proposal, I think it was last year in November or so, where we said 900 million tons. And we thought that this would be a discussion, because it's so sensical, that would get easy approval. And in reality, it turns out to be a bit more difficult than what we were hoping for. Because, and it comes from 2 ends. One end is kind of those who are skeptical about climate policies as such, and they see, okay, there's an area, new thing put onto the table for discussion, so let's try to attack that. And if this doesn't work, then the EU ETS will go under, the price might move to 0, And then maybe that's a way to kill entire climate policies. And then you have the people at the other end of the spectrum who say that, yeah, but backloading, putting these things into the fridge, that's not going to help. You need to do a structural measure. So why don't you propose a structural measure? And this is a kind of a little unholy alliance that was formed. It's gradually getting kind of, it's trickling through, but let's say, I think we'll get there. The next step in this discussion is a vote in the parliament that's going to happen mid-April, and that will be decisive in terms of whether it's going to happen or not. One other thing that got into the way is party politics, and that is party politics in Germany. You have a coalition government, the Christian Democrats and the Liberals, and the Liberals said, oh, they are against backloading because it's you interfere in the market, and we are against that. Now, Mr. Rösler is the vice chancellor, and Ms. Merkel has already so many conflicts with him, so it's very hard to kind of push him into one direction. So the Germans hope that there is sufficient votes in favor of the backloading, but we will see. We might need the German votes in the council as well. So you see, I think it's, yeah, politics that gets into the way.
Bob Larrick. I work with the UN NGO community. I wanted to thank you for your presentation and recognizing the importance of science and reality in these issues. You did bring up that we're all, it's not just a European issue, it's the whole world, and the issue of interconnectedness, the unemployment, the politics you were just talking about. We were hit right here in this area very hard by Hurricane Sandy, and actually the violence at elementary school, which is usually think of unrelated, but the issue of security and risk management, which these things and adaptation brings up, and the cost of that. Don't we need to develop a different type of, in this country, I'm sorry, the recognition of the importance of the environment and is not being recognized nationally. So the U.S. as a major polluter is not really getting up to speed, and as you brought up, that the developing countries also, as well as the debt loads all over the world. And doesn't it bring out that we need to develop a different type of politics which transcends the nationalist and ethnic orientations? And I'd worked with actually some of the European Union, I believe, was one of the leaders in UN reform in 2005, which didn't go very far because President Bush didn't believe in the UN, or thought the whole thing was too liberal, or blew everything off and put in Bolton. But don't these things bring up the increasing need, as well as the politics all over the world, the security risk, that we need a new type of a UN and a new type of global financial system where we can get the investments as well as the capacity building. I was promoting the need for a new institute within the UN, also a good government, holistic, interfaith business, security and development alliance institute, which is a mouthful, but also for a new type of a financial system in UN that can promote, help capitalism and democracy meet our human needs. And there's also, are you familiar with an economist, Emin Fingleton, F-I-N-G-L-E-T-O-N, who writes from the Tokyo about jaws in the jaws of the dragon. I'm sorry. I'll let you go. But some of the problems, problems in the economy are not just bouncing back. There's too much debt.
Yeah. No, maybe a short answer to your intervention is, of course, there's many problems that we need to fix. But when it comes to climate policy, I think we really have to try to move forward in a pragmatic manner. And if you try to bring too many things onto the table, then you will end up in a deadlock very quickly.
It's a problem.
And that is one of the problems of the UN negotiations. With 194 countries, the aspirations are different, the interests are different, and every country brings its own set of issues to the table. So the table is already very full.
Well, that's what I'm saying. We need to transcend exactly those things and build a different capacity because we're not meeting the expectations and needs of humanity.
But I can't see that revolution happening. And I can't see who is going to master that revolution because there is no such thing like a benevolent dictator.
So we have a problem.
We were running a little bit out of time and everybody wants to enjoy the reception following this, I think. So can we just take 1, 2, 3 questions and not too long, and then your response? Does it?
Okay. Yeah, that's
quite
fine.
Demanding.
Oh, no problem.
Okay.
Thanks for your presentation. European countries are doing fundamentally well than other countries regarding sustainable development and adaptation to climate change. And in your eyes, what are the incentives and the key factors to achieve these achievements, and what's your message to other economic entities?
Let's get the other. Oh, there. Okay, there.
Sure. It's a very quick question, a bit more of a political question. I was wondering, with regards to the objectives beyond 2020, has there been any debates, or has it occurred in talks that the climate change agenda, both for mitigation and adaptation, might be conflicting with further European integration or enlargement to new member states? Are the agendas conflicting? Are they interrelated? Can one enhance the other or be a barrier to one another?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you've seen the British Petroleum Energy Outlook through 2030, but China's utilization of coal through that time period is astronomical. And if everyone in the world did what they were supposed to, it'd be like everyone in here stopped smoking, but China was in the corner of the room smoking. We'd all get this secondhand smoke, and we would be no better off. What type of policy do you think the European Union and the international community can do to offset this?
I think it's really related to the first question. If you want to take climate policies forward in a national context, you need to be coming with a convincing case. That means there needs to be awareness in the voters in the country that this is an issue, that this needs to be addressed, and I think we enjoy that kind of support in the European Union still, despite the fact that also figures are, let's say, going up and down depending on actual politics. And that is something that is happening in China. There is kind of a very clear understanding that climate change and the adverse effects are going to hit the Chinese economy in a big way. And a lot of that has to do with water in China. Where does China get its water from? It's the agricultural bit, it's the industrial bit that all hangs on the water. And the projections in terms of climate change are dreadful when it comes to water availability for China. So it's not going to be killed because they have no access to oil or gas. No, it's the water question. That is central, and that is understood. And that means China will have to look for a solution for coal. And there is one which is called CCS. It's something where I think the verdict or the final judgment is still out because we have never tried it really at large scale. But in terms of the essential bits and pieces of that technology, they are known. And China is interested in testing this technology. And they are even doing that with their own money. They are not relying on European Union money or Australian money or US money. They might be the first ones who will have the first large-scale demonstration plant in place. So I think this realization is there on the side of the Chinese. On the short question, that was about, remind me.
It was about whether the climate agenda and integration or European enlargement
the integration. It's a good question. Because, of course, what happens with enlargement is that the EU economy gets more diverse. So if you look back at when the 6 countries that started once at the time, the European Union, economically they were much more homogeneous than what you now see with the EU 27. And in July this year will be EU 28 with Croatia coming on board, although Croatia is probably more to the center, to the middle, and not to the kind of one or the other extreme. So its policy making is becoming more difficult in Europe because of that diversity. On the other hand, there is a number of huge opportunities with climate policies. A lot of the potential we have, for instance, in energy efficiency is in the countries that are newcomers to the EU. So with that solidarity mechanism, you can trigger modernization in those countries. And that, of course, in turn, will increase the support of those countries for the European Union idea. So there is also many areas where you have opportunities and in moving forward. They have a very large potential on renewable energy that has not been tapped during the former times before the fall of the Iron Curtain. So again, there's investment opportunities there that are quite significant.
I think with this we can conclude, and thank you very much for